Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this morning slash afternoon, depending on where you are, or I could even say nighttime. I'd like to welcome you today to our webinar. We think that it's going to be very, very exciting for all of the attendees. And today we have a few fantastic speakers from Cooper Surgical, as well as externally. Our first speaker today is Dr. Tony Gordon. He will be talking to you about the updates to our tests in terms of our improvements and performance metrics. Dr. Gordon is a PhD in molecular cytogeneticist with over 20 years of experience in molecular diagnostics. In 2008, Tony Gordon started the 24-SHRE product line, helping conduct the first PGT-A array CGH tests. And in 2013, Dr. Gordon joined Genesis Genetics, a leading global company for PGT. In April of 2016, Genesis Genetics was acquired by Cooper Surgical companies. Since then, Dr. Gordon continues to work in the PGT field, publishing scientific papers, conducting scientific studies, and working to bring scientific developments and innovations to PGT. Dr. Gordon is a fellow of the Royal Society of Biology and a true pioneer and innovator in the field of reproductive genomics. So thanks for joining us today, Tony. We also have our second speaker, who is Chris Weir, who will be talking about primary template-directed amplification and innovations and our future services. Chris is a senior scientist at Cooper Surgical. He's led our research and development efforts in reproductive genomics since joining us in 2018. Chris has helped to identify opportunities and incorporating strategies into our assays and developing them. He has a degree in biomedical engineering from Johns Hopkins University, as well as his PhD. Thank you for joining us, Chris. And finally, we've got Doug Trowbridge. He will be talking about enhancing innovation and performance through streamlining processes. Doug is a true local of Phoenix, Arizona, where he was born and raised. He graduated from Arizona State University with a Bachelor of Science in Biology in 2008. Doug joined the Arizona practice as a senior embryologist in 2018 and has over 10 years of experience in embryology and andrology. He is now the laboratory supervisor overseeing all IVF and andrology staff procedures. He's mastered skills across all in vitro fertilization techniques and has amassed a vast network within the IVF community, locally and nationally. Again, I'd like to say hi, Doug, and thank you very much for joining us today. So a little bit of housekeeping for the group that's on this call and listening in. We will be having a Q&A session at the end of these talks. Please enter your questions into the Q&A link found at the bottom of the webinar. Take note that these questions will not appear on screen, but do not worry, we do have them, we do see them, and they will be addressed once we get to the end of this presentation, as mentioned. Thank you again for joining us today, and I will pass it off to Tony. Go ahead, Tony.
Thanks very much, Matt, and thanks for joining us. And as Matt said, please feel free to ask questions as we go through. We want to make it as interactive as possible, and we always love questions from the audience. So I'm just going to give you a quick introduction to pre-implantation genetic testing for aneuploidy, in case you don't know exactly some of the details. So PGT-A is a fairly simple technique in premise, and the technique is that we are taking a biopsy from an embryo at day 5 or day 6, and we're using very complicated DNA sequencing techniques really simply to count the number of chromosomes in that biopsy. So we look for the number of chromosomes, and if we see an embryo biopsy where all the cells in that biopsy have 46 chromosomes, like in the example to the right here, then they're more likely to implant, more likely to produce a successful, healthy live birth. So that's the simple premise. Next slide, please, Cody. So the actual technique isn't really so much about selecting the normals, the euploids. It's actually probably more, in some ways, about a deselection technique. So we're looking for the embryos with the wrong numbers of chromosomes, and they're going to be deprioritized for transfer or not transferred at all. So when I made this slide ages ago, I looked at my cytogenetics textbooks and looked to see whether there'd ever been a baby born with a trisomy 10, and no, there hadn't. So you know that if all the cells on that embryo have 3 copies of chromosome 10, it's not going to probably implant or lead to a pregnancy, and it certainly won't lead to a live birth. So you know that that embryo can be safely deselected. So it's sometimes a little complicated than that, but when it comes to additional whole chromosomes, additional chromosomes missing, this is the effect it's going to have. And you'd have more implantation failure, more miscarriage, or potentially affected live births if you get things like trisomy 13, 18, 21, or sex chromosomes. So that's the premise, that's the theory. As ever in biology, it's never quite as simple as that. Next slide, please. So mosaics. Mosaics are a kind of halfway house between the normals, the euploids, and the abnormals. And what happens is that in the first few divisions after fertilization, some cells don't separate and divide correctly, so that some cells will have more chromosomes than others. And you end up with this kind of patchwork of normals and abnormals in an embryo. So this was some data that we collected fairly recently. And one of the reasons why we collected this was just really to look at the impact of aneuploidy and the impact of mosaicism. So in this graphic, you can see in blue, aneuploidy increasing with maternal age. And instead of using the SART kind of 35 to 37, 38, 40 kind of groupings, we had enough data. This is from over 280,000 embryos biopsied. So we had enough data to divide it up per year, and you can see that there's a very progressive increasing aneuploidy with maternal age, and it's one of the predeterminants of the reduction in fertility with maternal age. In this graphic, aneuploidy increases 1% every 2 months between 35 and early 40s. 1% every 2 months, and that's really important for patients because it's not just about attempting IVF, it's also about time to live birth, because it's a kind of, unfortunately, a battle against time. The converse is finding euploids, and the euploids are here shown in orange, and as you can see, the potential to find a euploid decreases with maternal age, and that's one of the things that is a challenge, is finding euploids, because if you can find a euploid per embryo transfer, you'll have about the same success rate of a 35-year-old as a woman in her early 40s. So it's really important to look at that as well and try and find those euploids. And I think we're going to talk a bit about no results. And actually, if you can find a result from every embryo becomes precious if they're euploids, especially with advanced maternal age. Mosaicism, and we divide it up into 2 classes, where the predominant number of cells are normal. That's a low-level mosaic, or we have all mosaics. And mosaics are something that we've been looking at for years, and most people are getting a bit more comfortable about transferring them, and they have some negative outcomes, but they can result in healthy live births. And you can see, though, if you include mosaics for transfers, it can have quite a large impact. That impact goes down a little bit as you get to the mid-40s, and that's just because there's so much aneuploidy. It's hard to find a mosaic. Next slide, please. And this just shows you some examples of mosaicism. In green, we have euploid cells in an embryo, and in blue, we have aneuploid cells. And although I'm not an embryologist, I'll go through this. Up on the top left of these circles is the inner cell mass, and then the trophectoderm all around. And on the left example is an embryo where all the cells are a mixture of euploid and aneuploid. So if you take a biopsy, you're probably likely to get a fairly good result. And on the right, the inner cell mass is aneuploid, and there's some euploids in the trophectoderm, and if you've got some euploids, you might miss that mosaicism, that aneuploidy in the inner cell mass. Really, mosaics, all we can tell is what's in the biopsy and then try and infer what's in the rest of the embryo. And what we've seen so far with mosaicism results from the really important work carried out by the International Registry of Mosaic Embryos Transfer, they implant less, they miscarry more compared to euploids, but they can lead to live births, unlike aneuploid embryos. Next slide, please. So Cooper Surgical, we've been working really hard over the last few years, and Chris's team and the excellent work our R&D team does have been helping us try and detect mosaics more accurately. And this is a couple of quite kind of complicated graphs, but I'll try and talk you through them. So up on the top left, we have what we call copy number. So this is counting chromosomes. If it says CN2, that's copy number 2 for the chromosomes, and the chromosomes go from 1 on the left to 22 on the right, then X and Y. And if the red line shows it at copy number 2, that's 2 normal chromosomes. But you can see there's a gain there on chromosome 7 and another one on chromosome 13 in little blips in the red line. And they are mosaics, what some people also call intermediate copy numbers. And detecting mosaics is quite controversial because up until now, everybody's been saying, well, you can count chromosomes, but are these artifacts? We don't see them with SNPs. And SNPs is a second way you can count chromosomes. So you can just look at the amount of DNA that's there, but you can also look to see what you've inherited from the maternal and paternal copies. And this is SNPs. If you look down on the bottom graph, it's a little noisy, but if you can see at chromosomes 7 and 13, there's like a dispersion of the data. And that's actually counting mosaics with SNPs. And this is really the first time anybody's been able to do this. And this is what we can do with our new technology that Chris is going to talk to us a little bit after this presentation. So it's really interesting to see where we are with looking at SNPs. And I think it's going to be interesting to see how far we can push this technology and see both of these things working in dual concert to give us a really robust result. Next slide, please. And this shows some of this really interestingly graphically. So on the left axis, the vertical axis, you can see SNP calling from 0 to 100%. So anything in the middle, sort of 20 to 80%, is a mosaic. 0 is euploid, 100% is aneuploid. And the same at the bottom. This is counting the chromosomes from the amount of DNA, copy number counting. Again, 0 in the bottom left, euploid, 100% aneuploid. You can see up on the top right-hand corner, these are all aneuploids that agree with the SNPs and agree with the copy number. Then you can see a kind of dispersed data set, which is highly correlating, showing that either deletions, which are in red, or duplications, which are in blue in the triangles, you can see them in that intermediate copy number between 25% or 20%, 75%, where you get a very good correlation between these two independent data sets, SNPs and CMV. And there are platforms out there that are reporting CMV, and there are platforms out there that are reporting SNPs. This is the first time one platform has really reported these two things accurately for mosaics, not just whole chromosomes, but partial chromosomes as well. So it's not just whole chromosomes that we're reporting here, it's segmental aneuploidies as well, parts of chromosomes. So this is, I think, really going to be transformative data and show how well we can do this. There are some really other interesting areas of biology that I think Chris is going to mention that we're beginning to see as well. Next slide, please. So one of the things that people ask us, we've moved technology. Do we see an improvement in our results? Well, we've got this new DNA technique called PGT-A. Apologies to everybody about the acronym, the use of P's and T's and A's. And this is a new DNA amplification technique called primary template derived amplification. Chris is going to explain about it after this, but when we actually run through and see this and see how it's working compared to our previous system, we see more euploids, which is obviously really good. And we see about the same number of aneuploids, but we see a reduction in the mosaics because we're able to call those mosaics more accurately. Now, there's a little bit of data here that's not shown, which is the polyploids. So it shows you that this is really improving the results. The other thing which is super interesting is we see no difference in our no results. We've worked really hard to make sure that PTA works as well as the previous technology, and I'm sure Doug can discuss no results further on. Next slide, please. So as things stand, we have our PTA-based platform. We can test for aneuploidy using these two techniques. We can use this SNPs like a barcode to detect whether the embryo matches the parents. We can use it to look for the origin of aneuploidy if we have some DNA from the parents, and also even look to help embryologists with their PN pronuclear checking to show that sometimes embryos that are called by embryologists as failed PNs, abnormally fertilized, actually can be diploid, can be normal of a number of chromosomes, and can lead to live births. Next slide, please. So over to you, Chris. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Tony. Yeah, so I wanted to take a few minutes here at the beginning just to talk about the critical nature of amplification in the IVF process, and then to underscore just how much of a shift PTA has created, particularly as it pertains to our current assays, but also in how it's really changing our viewpoint about where PGT-A is moving, and the way we're shifting in our focus as well a little bit, or at least improving the tests as we move along. And so if you see on the right here, this is a timeline of the development of amplification technologies. And you can see that most of the current workhorses in the industry are more than 15 years old. They've provided very solid results, but at the same time, they've left some holes in the genome that we as assay development have tried to fill in, to try to take and extrapolate that information, and we've done a very good job with that. But I think when PTA was first kind of published around 2020, I think we all recognized the potential of it. And in 2022, Cooper exclusively licensed the technology. And for about a year now, we've worked to really put that technology into place, to leverage it, not only PGT-A, but PGT-M as well. And I think it is important to recognize just how important this step is in the entire process. What we're trying to do here is take somewhere around 5 cells or 50 picograms worth of DNA and create all of the input that will then be used for subsequent tests, right? And that's about 1,000 nanograms. So you're talking about amplifying something about 20,000 times. And on top of that, this is the first step in the process, and it really is critical to make that the best outcomes possible, right? And so we'll just talk a little bit about what's unique in the PTA process that gives it these capabilities that we weren't capable, or we couldn't realize before. But now that we're seeing this, we're able to take advantage and really push the envelope, really employ this in the current testing and then beyond. Next slide. And so we won't go into the actual chemistry about what's happening behind PTA here, but I think it behooves us to talk about the qualities that make PTA different from previous technologies. And then I think it'll become obvious how this is then complemented by other changes in the pipeline that we've implemented. So firstly, it is a very robust technology, and it has to be, right? This is that first step in the process. A failure at this point is impossible to come back from, right? And so we've done everything to improve this, to make this a very robust amplification tech, and we've seen that now as we move forward. Secondly, it's an incredibly accurate technology. The enzymes used in this process, in addition to the way and the unique nature that it amplifies the genome, creates very few errors, right? We're not making copies of copies. We're actually forcing all products to come from the original genome. And that's really important because you're not seeing errors propagate from branches or from thermal cycling type approaches. You really are getting original, products to then base the assay on, right? And then thirdly, it's a very complete approach to amplifying the genome. Because you're getting short segments, because you're getting better opportunity to spread out where your segments are coming from, we see a lot less bias, right? We're amplifying the genome very broadly with very, very little dropout across the genome. And that's important too. It's a very complete amplification in the sense that we get both alleles that are being contributed. We're not seeing significant allele dropout. We see both the maternal and the paternal contributions. And then finally, to just touch on that again, there's the approach that PTA leverages, it preserves the allelic balance. So the contributions from the maternal and paternal side are preserved, whereas in other amplification technologies, that's actually lost as you amplify, right? And I think it'll become obvious why those things are really important and just how we're using those to really change our approach to PGT and how we're going to continue to do that into the future. Next slide. And so as Tony mentioned, we're currently using this in our PGT-A approach, where we're not only looking at copy number variation, but then looking further underneath that data to confirm those changes with SNP data. And that SNP data is very deep. We're targeting approximately 30,000 SNPs across the genome, getting about 70x depth on those SNPs. So the quality, the accuracy, and the confidence in those SNPs is superior. We're also able to collect more than what we've targeted because of the nature of targeted sequencing. We're getting not only our SNPs in question, but we're also getting SNPs in close proximity. And so we actually interrogate approximately 150,000 SNPs across the genome. And so what you can see here on the left again is that whole copy number change in two parts of the genome, one segmental on chromosome 12 and one whole chromosome on 21 there, right? And you can see that not only are we realizing the change in copy number variation, as shown on the sort of larger red line graph, we're also seeing that in the SNP contribution underneath. You can see that instead of that one-to-one contribution that you'd expect, it would generate a single cluster. We're actually seeing a slight change there. We're seeing a 2-to-1 contribution, right? And that's moved those to 2 clusters, right? So we're confirming all of these copy number changes with additional SNP data. The question then is, how do we then extend this? We're using it for this purpose. How do we then use this SNP data at high resolution, at good depth, with superior confidence to really move the needle on future iterations of this test? Next slide. And so here are some of the things that we're looking at. And I want to emphasize that, we recognize that, it's got to be a very concrete kind of a approach. The result has to connect genotype to phenotype. And I think that's important. High confidence is only important if we can also deliver actionable results. And so a couple of the things that are immediately on our plate are increasing that segmental resolution. Can we really pick up those fine mutations, smaller changes in the genome that would have a clinical impact? As we mentioned before, mosaicism is also something that we're trying to really get a better kind of resolution on and realize what its impact clinically is. One of the other things that we're looking at is the loss of heterozygosity. So this combined with the next sort of column here, deletions and duplications, these may be rare events, but certainly are tied with very significant clinical outcomes. And as we refine and look at this genome closer with greater granularity, are we able to more definitively and confidently call these as well, giving patients and physicians more data to take a look and base those transfer ideas or transfer options on. The third one is a little bit more far-reaching, but certainly something that PTA as combined with other elements like targeted sequencing perhaps gives us the opportunity to do. We can look a little bit deeper and look for de novo mutations or predisposition genes, something that we're not seeing perhaps in the parents, but we can pick up in the embryo as well. And I think that's something that if we can tie critical changes, direct genetic mutations to clinical outcomes, this is a very valuable piece of data as we look further. And finally, on this fourth column, we've highlighted 3 things that potentially expand the scope of PGT-A, making this more broad, but likely a test that may not be available to everyone or may not be within reach of everyone. Can we make this a more precise test? Can we leverage PTA in a manner where we actually make this more accessible by targeting certain disorders that might be more important to certain populations? Can PGT-A then be made accessible to more people, right? And so the next slide, just to take a little bit of a deeper dive into one of those that I've just mentioned, right? So what we're talking about here is very small, minor variation with major clinical impact, as the slide says. And this is, looking at deletion and duplication syndromes. These are small segmental changes, either a gain or a loss, that have been tied very closely with clinical syndromes, right? And we've listed a handful of those on the right here. And while rare, 1 in about 500 births, they do have a very significant clinical outcome. And you can see here on the left, in this particular embryo, if you were to look, just at a cursory glance across this embryo at the top, it appears to have, 2 copies of every chromosome, which it does. But if you start to look a little bit, closer with finer resolution, you can see there on chromosome 5, there's a loss, right? You can see that the line dips just a bit. And when we look a little bit closer with SNPs that underlie that data, you can see that there is actually, in fact, a small loss at that P arm of chromosome 5 there. And that's been tied closely with Cre-de-Shot, right? Again, we're trying to sort of differentiate what we believed were, or what we believe are euploids with some of the finer details that we're now able to pick up because of, again, PTA's ability to broadly amplify the genome and then to generate allelic balance with SNPs that we can then look at even deeper. Right. Next slide. So this is another small minor variation that seems or could potentially have significant clinical impact. And again, if you're looking at this embryo on the left, it would seem to be a euploid embryo. There's 2 copies of all chromosomes with no segmental changes as measured by copy number variation. But if you look down below, you can see that there are 2 segments, one on chromosome 2 and one on chromosome 7, where the SNP data doesn't support, or seemingly doesn't support, that 2 copy numbers, right? What it looks like is that you've got a loss of contribution, that all SNPs in these segments are identical. And this is loss of heterozygosity. And this can happen for a number of different reasons. Perhaps the most common, or the one we might recognize the most, is consanguinity. But there's also some biological reasons in sort of repair mechanisms that could generate this kind of phenomena as well. And so you've got represented here only contributions from one of the parents. And this comes into play for things like imprinting disorders, right? And while, again, not common, this does have a very significant clinical phenotype. And detecting this could actually differentiate what would appear to be a euploid embryo from an embryo that may actually not be ideal for transfer, or at least something that we would want to consider as we move down the IVF process, right? And so again, these are just 2 examples of some of the things that we're working on to really leverage PTA to get a finer resolution, a more accurate, and a more confident kind of outcome from PGT-A testing. Next slide. And this is that sort of third column that I mentioned. This is the direct mutation analysis, where we're trying to, perhaps leverage PTA in an approach that looks directly at known, clinically impactful genetic mutations. And here you can see we've taken about 200 embryos with a panel of mutations. This is actually generated from our PGT-M cohorts. Right, so we know that there is a mutation present or potentially present in these embryos, and we want to look at our ability to detect that directly without testing the maternal or the paternal samples, and even as PGT-M gets rolled into this, without requiring a relative for testing as well, right? And what we saw was that we were able to actually in concert with PGT-A along the same timeline, identify in 200 of these embryos the mutation that we knew to be present or lack thereof, right? And what you can see here on the right is just an example of that. We targeted BRCA1 in these 4 embryos, and we saw that there was actually an embryo that carried each of the expected outcomes. The first one being a paternal carrier, right? The second, a maternal carrier, which you can see here with this shift or this change from A to G in orange. The third embryo is unaffected and would likely be ideal for transfer. And the fourth embryo here actually carries both mutations and would likely be affected, or at least would have BRCA, a BRCA mutation in both genes, which could be deleterious down the line. Right? And so this is also something that we're kind of developing or looking to continue, investigating is what is our capability to really interrogate the genome deeper and connect these genetic changes with phenotypic changes or phenotypic outcomes, and then give that patient and the physician a little bit more data to make the transfer decision on. Next slide. And so while we haven't employed direct mutation analysis yet, what we have done is employ a fast-track PGT-M approach, where we've taken the normally 2 to 3 months process and shrunk that down to approximately 4 weeks. And that, it really is a significant change in turnaround time. And we've seen, the same accurate, confident results that we did before, but we're now providing those in a timeline that's much more amenable to the laboratory process, to the IVF process. And so I think, as we continue to move forward, we'll continue to bring those outcomes, with better accuracy, with higher confidence, with perhaps better resolution as well, and hopefully, also deliver things with a timeline that's going to be more clinically amenable. So thank you. I'll pass this on to Doug now.
Thank you, Chris. First, I'd just like to start by saying thank you to everyone at Cooper for having me this morning. Also, everyone joining the call. We appreciate you guys spending a little bit of time with us to go over Cooper's PGT platform. I think that we can all agree from Dr. Gordon and Chris's presentation that their scientific methods are strong, and what they've been working on, the innovation that they've been creating, has really advanced the PGT technology forward, so that it can really affect what matters most, which is clinical outcomes, patient care. So I'd like to just shift the conversation away from the scientific method realm for a second and go into more of the clinical side of this technology. Obviously, as stated before, I'm an embryologist. I'm still an embryologist. I work every day in an embryology laboratory, and the most important thing to me is how does this affect the clinic, and how does this affect the patients that we help? And I'd like to just go through a couple of things that I think that we can do as embryologists to really maximize the strength of the testing through accuracy. So first, I think that it's important for us all to understand that just like every diagnostic test that a laboratory will perform, not just an embryology laboratory, but any laboratory, that sampling matters. The types of samples, the quality of the samples, how the samples are collected, this will and can affect the results that we see in the clinic. Obviously, which will further down the line can affect the clinical outcomes for the patient. So the first thing that I'd like to just go over is that, again, sampling does matter. How we collect these samples will affect the testing. So in all diagnostic tests, not just PGT testing, but in all diagnostic tests, there is a rejection criteria. It's a requirement for diagnostic testing in all laboratories. So in PGT, it's about 1 to 2% of the time normally that you'll receive failure to amplify or a no result, meaning the data that they received, they can't have enough confidence to give us a result that they deem as accurate. a lot of the time, if not all of the time, these results stem directly from the samples that were placed into the tubes for testing. So the question is what can we do to ensure that we receive the lowest no result rate that we can, so that we can get the most accurate, strongest results to our patients? And I'm going to go over a couple of things that I think we can all do inside of our embryology laboratory that'll help us improve these results. And the other thing is we go through these methods that I employ in my laboratories that I believe help reduce these rates, is that not only is this going to impact the patient clinical outcomes, but these no result rates, they have a very strong indication on how your laboratory is performing. So not only can we use these to get better results for their patients, but we can also use these results as an indicator of how the labs are performing, or where we might be able to improve efficiencies in our laboratories. So things like laboratory conditions, the proficiencies of embryologists and the conditions of your culturing, even the quality of the embryo or the technique that's used to remove the cells. These are all indicators of through the no result rate. So if we can have a slide, please. So again, just to reiterate kind of what I just said there, that all of these things have this influence on this no result rate. And I'm going to go through a couple of these here to show you and explain kind of what I'm keying in on, what I'm looking for inside of my laboratories that have allowed us to not only achieve but maintain extremely low no result rates. Most of the time for my laboratories, we're somewhere at about 0.5% for these rates. Again, remembering that about 2% and below is an acceptable normal rate for this type of read when you're submitting PGT samples. Slide, please. So first things first is the embryo. I am a very strong believer that the embryo has a very large responsibility in whether or not we get very strong, accurate results from PGT testing. So things not only like the morphology of the embryos, but also the developmental stage and the strength of the embryo when you decide to remove the cells. As you can see here, I have two embryos, two blastocysts. I think that most embryologists would agree that both of these blastocysts are very good quality, nice looking blastocysts. Now, does that mean that both of these blastocysts are ready to be biopsied for PGT testing? I'm not so sure that I would agree with that. The embryo on the left here, obviously a clear, fully expanded, non-hatching, very beautiful 4AA in my opinion, very compact ICM. But even more importantly, I think you can see the abundance of trophectoderm cells and the continuity that they have. They're very scalloped and spread, and they're very tightly connected. And you can see that because the cells have kind of come together in a very tight, clean way. And when that embryo is biopsied, it's going to have a very strong chance of the cells remaining cohesive and together so that you can safely remove some cells. Conversely, the embryo on the right, we have again a very nice embryo, good compacting ICM, trophectoderm cells which are herniating and hatching. I think for all the experienced embryologists here, we can probably tell by the site of the zona pellucida there that this embryo was probably hatched on day 3, which has led to the herniation probably somewhere near day 5 or day 6. Now, the question is this a good time for us to be biopsying this embryo? Even though I think this embryo is fantastic in quality, I'm not so sure that it would be based on the appearance of the trophectoderm cells. You can see comparatively to the embryo on the left that the trophectoderm cells are still quite fluffy. They're not as cohesive and together, and the abundance is not there as well. We just don't have as many of them. A large part of this, again, might be due to the fact that we've hatched the embryo early on and that it's hatching more as an action of what we've done instead of natural hatching. So this embryo, I would say in my laboratories, are the embryos that we try to allow to develop a little further along. because the issue can be is that those trophectoderm cells right now, because of the fluffy and nature of not having a lot there, they just don't have a really good opportunity to stay together in a cohesive piece that we can place into the tube without excessive lysine or damage to the cells. Slide, please. Also, as mentioned, the biopsy technique is extremely important when we are talking about quality of the sampling of the piece that goes inside the tube for testing. Remember, as Chris explained, we are taking these 4 or 5 cells and we're amplifying them 20,000 times. That's a lot of amplification. So that means even with as strong as their technology has grown through all their innovation, this means that the samples that are originally in the tube, they have to be very good quality sampled pieces. The biopsy technique, I think, as all embryologists can admit, is an extremely important part of this discussion. We all in IVF labs do things slightly differently. I think that if you go into 10 different IVF labs, you'll find us all doing probably 10 variations of almost the same thing. It's kind of a unique phenomenon to the embryology world. Why do I have lettuce on the slide? It seems almost to have nothing to do with embryology. The reason is because a very good friend of mine once gave me an extremely simple, easy analogy of what we are doing to the cells of an embryo. The laser is obviously a tool that is needed in the embryology laboratory in order for us to remove these cells from the embryos. The laser can also cause issues when biopsying if not used properly. So my analogy comes back to a head of lettuce. If I take a knife, in this analogy, the knife will be the laser, and I take the knife and I cut it down directly through the center of a head of lettuce, as you can see has clearly been done on the right, what will happen is we are indiscriminately cutting and slicing through cells of the lettuce, because the cells fundamentally, or the lettuce, excuse me, is fundamentally just a grouping of cells. So if I take the knife or the laser and I indiscriminately cut directly through the head of lettuce, what you'll see is you'll see the browning of the lettuce, or the death of the cells. This is a very good analogy to what will happen if you just indiscriminately fire through pieces of an embryo with a laser. You will have cells that will lyse and that will essentially wilt. And these are the cells that you're placing into tube to be amplified 20,000 times. Conversely, the picture on the left, you can see if we take the same head of lettuce and we allow the cells, we pull the cells apart mechanically, and we allow the cells to separate on their own, we know that that the cells will be much happier with us, because essentially the cells are separating at the junctions in which they decide. And because they are coming apart from where they would like to come apart from, the cells are much happier and they're much healthier once the piece has actually been removed from the embryo. So it's important, I believe, to remember that the laser, while a useful tool, should only be used in conjunction. And I think that more of a mechanical separation of the cells from the embryo will yield you more or higher quality PGT pieces for amplification. Slide, please. A couple of other things that are important. Obviously, removing the pieces from the embryo is one very important part of the equation. But what do we do when we have the pieces removed from the embryo? Loading the cells into the PCR tubes for amplification is an extremely important part of the process for obtaining high-level results. Things like laminar airflow can be problematic. I understand, and we all agree that we need to remain as clean and sterile as possible while loading the cells in the tubes. But just remember, we're dealing with extremely low level, low volume microfluidic drops that are they can evaporate, essentially. Excuse me. They're susceptible to evaporation. Thank you. So it's important to remember, as we're rushing airflow across these micro drops, that evaporation can occur, which can affect the nature of the buffer and also the quality of the piece. Cell washing, also an extremely vital part of the cell loading process. As we all know, or we should hopefully know, oil is a disruptor to the amplification on the PGT side. So we want to make sure that we get as much of the oil from the pieces removed as possible prior to entering the tube. Things like changing pipettes, using clean pipettes, or step down washing through the buffer that's provided can help you reduce that oil. I always train all of my embryologists that by the time you're into your last washing drop and ready to load in the tube, you should never see any oil slicking on the media. If you're seeing oil slicking, then we're not washing properly. So it's a thing for us in the laboratory to pay very close attention to. And then the last thing is the cell loading. The amount of buffer that's placed inside of the tubes matters. Too much buffer can lead to a higher no result rate in the laboratory. So it's very important that we reduce the amount of buffer, and we absolutely stay under the recommended amount from Cooper, of which should be placed in the tube. One of the things that I like to do in my laboratories and teach people is to really use the tools that are around you. We have obviously here just a classic stripper, which I love. One of the things that I am sure of is to set my stripper to the exact amount that I would ever, the most that I would ever want to be placed inside the tube. I go into a lot of laboratories across the country, and it always surprises me how often I do not see embryologists utilizing this part of the tool. It's almost as if they're not understanding that this is a mechanism built into the stripper. But you can dumb these strippers down, you can set them to a certain amount, and so that you'll never exceed the amount that you want in the tube. And this is how I have my stripper set. And again, I am just training my embryologists and focusing on just a very minimal amount of buffer loaded into the PCR tube. So next slide, please. And then the storage and shipping of the cells. Again, for us to achieve these extremely low no result rates and very strong, accurate results from Cooper, we have to make sure that we're very particular about everything, even the most simplest of things, which would be storage and shipping of the cells. So we're always making sure that we remain below -20 degrees Celsius when storing of the cells. After cells are biopsied, tubed, and frozen, in our laboratories, we're ensuring that the cells should never thaw after frozen. So when we have day 6 or day 7 biopsies and we've already previously biopsied embryos and have them frozen, we always make sure that we keep the cells in the freezer and find different efficient ways to load the new cells without dragging the previously frozen cells out. Again, the whole thought process here is to remain frozen for the previously biopsied cells. And then again, simple things just like kit shipping, placing your kits into the boxes with ample use of ice packs to remain cool temperatures, and to secure the kits with tape, and using things like packing paper or bubble wrap. Again, this is a very simple concept, but the idea here is we're going to be placing these into a courier and shipping them across country. I'm in Arizona. I think they go to New York. I don't want them rattling around for the next day, and we all know how it can be with shipping on with couriers and airplanes. The thing is to secure the kit so that we're not having a lot of jostling around inside the box. So we use ice packs, bubble wraps, and papers to really make sure that we have a secure shipment environment for those kits. And then the last thing is just a quick case study. The question is, does this work? Does all this attention to detail and all of these little things that we're looking at and that we're doing and we're making sure that are exactly right and that we've improved on, does it work? And I think that the answer is quite clear that yes, it does work. Recently, my company purchased an IVF laboratory about 2 hours away from Scottsdale, Arizona. This began at the beginning of 2024. This was a long-standing clinic in their area. And when we completed the acquisition and they became part of the Pinnacle Fertility Network and Advanced Fertility Care team, one thing that we identified was that we had a higher than normal no result rate from the PGT labs, not just Cooper Surgical, but other labs as well. We have a lot of data from Cooper Surgical, and the results say that it was about a 10% no result rate. Again, we're probably about 5 times too high there on the no result rate. So what we did when we went into the laboratory was we identified the little things that we knew would help the results that we could improve very simply. Again, things like embryology proficiency, biopsy technique, the culture conditions, embryo selection. All of these things were what we identified, and over the next 2 to 3 months, we made every adjustment that we've needed to make. And since then, in 2024, we've fallen from 10 to 5% no recall rate, so a half reduction. And most recently, they've gone through their most recent batch. We're an IVF batching clinic, meaning we do all of our IVF cases within a 2-week period for each month. In this most recent batch, we've fallen to 2% no result rate. And there's no reason for me to believe, as long as we consistently do the things that we know work, that we will maintain these no result rates. So again, these are very simple, easy things that we can all be paying attention to in order to improve the quality of care that we give to our patients. And in closing, the last thing that I would urge any embryologist or clinic that's using the Cooper platform is to have good discussions with Cooper. They're a very open company. They're extremely transparent. In my workings with them, they've always been willing to have the conversations in an attempt to get the best results. And I think that one of the things they do really well is they give you fantastic feedback. So they have obviously they have all the results and information from the samples that you submit through to them, not only quarterly but yearly. You can very simply request these reports from them, and they can give you an outlook of how your laboratory is performing. Again, this is a great window. It's just another fantastic KPI. It's a great window into the performance of your laboratory. Again, I would like just to thank you guys for having me this morning and spending your time with us, and I hope that this helps.
Right. Thanks very much, Doug. Super presentation. Why has nobody ever explained the lettuce analogy to me before? It is great, and it's such a beautiful analogy of the way that lasers are used. I think that's fantastic. It's also really fabulous to see the attention to detail you have. You know, for us in the genetics lab, we just received these tubes with hopefully something in them. And to see that attention to detail is great. I just have a couple of quick questions before we move on to the questions from the audience. And if we have any questions for the audience, we're probably going on a little bit over the hour because we've had such good conversation, but we'll try and see how we go. But please, if you've got any questions, put it into the Q&A. But we do already have some questions come through. Doug, I was going to ask you, what's your kind of criteria for embryo grading and what you accept for biopsy? Are you pretty lenient, do you think, or do you think you're pretty stringent? Oh, you're on mute, Doug.
Knew it was going to happen.
Always does.
So it had to. We practice, guys. They prepped me. It's not Cooper's fault. It's mine. No, I am extremely stringent on embryo quality. I believe that embryo quality is such an important factor on whether or not only that you get a result, but that you get an accurate result, right? We all want euploid embryos. We all want the patients to get euploid embryos, and that's fantastic. But what I want accurate, strong results. And I think that when you start to utilize a lower quality embryo in the biopsy embryos that are most likely on their way to apoptosis or to degeneration, if you're pushing these embryos, a lot of the times that's where you're going to get the results that either are no results, or you might have results that aren't as strong as you like. But also another thing that I explain to my patients all the time is I want to make sure that we get you good results, but also that we get you good embryos, because without good embryos, we don't really have the ability to complete the process, which is giving the patient the baby. So in my lab, we use just the standard Gardner grading, but we never worked with C. So it has to be an A or B in both grades. And again, the biggest thing for me is beyond what letter we assign it is really it's the look of the embryo. I've really trained my embryologists to make sure that we biopsy that embryo when it is telling us it is ready. We look at things like the thickness of the zona, the cohesiveness of the ICM, the compaction of the ICM, the cohesiveness of the trophectoderm cells, the abundance. Those are the things after biopsying, I've been biopsying for over about 15 years at this point, thousands and thousands of embryos. I have a very strong feel of what cells will come off of the embryo safely and what cells will not. That's what I am looking to in the laboratory to tell me, is this a good embryo for us to biopsy?
Yeah, it's fascinating to hear you talk about this, Doug, because it's a mixture of science and art, really.
Yeah,
it is. It is. And what about rebiopsy? What's your kind of opinion on rebiopsy? Do you rebiopsy? How do you find the success rates of rebiopsy?
Yes, we rebiopsy the embryos when we have no result rate. Again, it's about 2% or less of the time. One of the things that we can all accomplish from improving our processes is reducing the amount of rebiopsies. Again, one, it's going to give you better patient care. If we're all being honest, I think that we need to explain to patients that the rebiopsying of embryos in some way, we're not sure, but in some way probably does impact the viability of the embryo. We're thawing it, we're biopsying and taking more cells, we're freezing it with the perspective of thawing it again. If we cannot admit to the patients that this probably will reduce implantation potential, I'm not sure that we're being transparent and honest. So I think that's very important for us to understand. Nonetheless, patients, we do 95% PGT in my clinics. Patients, they want these results. The only time that they would probably choose not to is if they have an abundance of normal embryos. They just don't need it. But most of the time, they need these results for transfer. So we will rebiopsy the embryos, but we always preface the conversation of rebiopsy with the patient of the fact that we have to maintain a very strict criteria when choosing to rebiopsy the embryo or not. We cannot guarantee that every embryo that's been biopsied can be rebiopsied. There is a reevaluation assessment that must occur prior to that, again, in accordance with trying to get a good result the second time, making sure that the embryo will sustain its viability through that process.
Cool. Thanks, Doug. So we have some questions that come from the audience, and we're running up to the hour, but I think this is such an interesting conversation. We're going to go over for a few minutes and go through some of the questions that we have. And the next question is for Chris. It sounds like a lot of labs are using NGS, also starting to use SNPs. Is your NGS plus SNPs an add-on for the PGT-A, or does it automatically happen with every test?
Yeah, Tony, it's certainly become a hot topic. People or companies are combining CNV with SNP data. But for Cooper, the test currently does employ SNP data with CNV data in all PGT-A tests. Anything that's proposed as potentially showing a variation in copy numbers then reflexively analyzed with SNPs to deliver a result to confirm that change.
Cool. Thanks, Chris. I have one that I'm going to answer because it's coming through. It says from the question is, my understanding that SNP array cannot readily detect mosaicism. What's the difference in your SNP calling and the confirmation clarification of mosaic calls? Well, it really comes back down to the amplification, because trying to explain this without being too into the weeds is that if you use PCR, you lose the kind of underlying data of SNPs, so you end up being able to see them or not see them. Mosaicism is a kind of halfway house. So with platforms that use SNP arrays or some of the other platforms that use PCR to amplify the material, it's super hard to see mosaicism. So they tend not to see them. Sometimes they say the mosaicism doesn't exist, or they just say that it is reported as a kind of incidental finding in the reports. The difference with PTA is that really it's the first time where we kind of maintain the quality of the data such that we can see not just the whole gains and losses, but the SNPs in between with the mosaicism in between with the SNPs. So it's, you know, we're finding it a super interesting subject. So one for Doug here. Doug, what training and quality control measures, I guess KPIs is the question, do you implement to ensure consistency, accuracy of the biopsy process across your team members? Quite a big question, actually.
Yeah, so it's a fantastic question. It's a very important question because we need to make sure prior to embryologists working on samples that are going to be used, you know, embryos that are going to be used to help people create families, that they're proficient. And not only that, you know, that we make sure that they are proficient, but that they remain proficient. So, you know, obviously every laboratory needs to have a very stringent training policy in place, provided by the leadership there. You know, how as far as how you get them trained. But I think that what, you know, the safest thing to do is, again, to work with Cooper Surgical to help you achieve these proficiencies and prove that these embryologists are proficient. The ways that you can do this, for instance, with tubing, what I do with my tubing technologists, you know, you can work with Cooper to have the patients use either research embryos, you know, to remove pieces and tube them into the cells, and Cooper will actually run and amplify them. And this can be your validation that, you know, an embryologist can safely place the pieces into the tube. For biopsies, obviously there's an immense amount of practice and work that goes into an embryologist prior to them biopsying an embryo. But once they start to biopsy the embryo, the important thing is to really make sure that you are safe for the patients once you begin this process. So what I'll do is, if my embryologist has progressed through their training, maybe the first embryo I'll allow them to biopsy will be maybe the 10th embryo a patient has for that cycle, a good prognosis patient that we're expecting good PGT results on, like I said, that has an abundance of embryos. Now, this embryo is probably, you know, most likely never going to get utilized just because of the efficiency that we've, you know, in the results that we've received in my laboratory, but it will start to give them the experience. And then I'll start to inch them forward towards embryos that can be utilized, right? So I'll give them, you know, maybe a patient that has a little bit less and an embryo that, you know, of better quality that will be utilized. And you have to kind of just inch along the way till you can start to see some of these embryos being thawed out, transferred, and the clinical outcomes start to come with the biopsy embryologist statistics. And that's a very safe way for you to ensure that they can complete this process very safely for the patients and for the clinic. But again, guys, just make sure, I cannot express to you enough what a vital resource Cooper Surgical can be to all of us. They're not just the company that is that's giving us this testing and taking our business. They're the company that's working with us. This is their product, and they want their product to work. They have a lot of investment behind this, and they're invested just as much in the patient care as we are. So work with them because they have a lot of resources. They have training centers and embryologists, and they can amplify your sample tubes, and they just have there's a lot of resource there for you guys to drill into. And I really do urge people to, you know, to reach out and to work with them.
Thanks, Doug. You're saying all the right things that make us all happy, but honestly, it is always a partnership between us and the embryology lab to get the best results. It's never one or the other. It really is. Yeah,
Tony. I mean, again, I say these things. It's not because it's like it's the right thing to say. I've worked with you guys for a while now. I've just achieved the best results working with you. I've had really good communication. And the most important thing to me at this point in my career is that I have the best clinical outcomes for my patients. That's the most important thing for me. And I know that I've been able to achieve the best I have with, you know, working with you guys. So this is why I'm so invested, you know, in this platform.
I think it's such a great thing to hear. It's such a great thing to hear. We're a bit over time, but we have quickly, I think, one or two questions that we'll do, and then I'll hand over to Matt. So, Chris, does the number of SNPs in a test actually matter?
Yeah, that's a really good point,
test.
Especially in light of that last question. The SNPs become more integrated with more and more PGT tests. So, you know, one thing I think it's important to recognize that any one SNP, like any single data point, is going to be subject to some variability. And so if you're basing a test or an outcome only on a handful of those SNPs, noise can become an issue. The ability to actually resolve some of that variation can certainly lead to false positives, false negatives. And so it's really not any one SNP, it's the accumulation of a number of SNPs in any one region that gives you confidence in your accurate result. And so, you know, yes, more SNPs certainly does matter. A higher density of SNPs does make for better resolution and more confident, accurate outcomes in that sense.
Cool. Thanks, Chris. Very last question, one for Chris again. And it's such an interesting subject. It's no wonder the question came in. And we did get a bunch of questions from the audience, and I'm sorry we haven't had time to answer those questions. But last one for Chris. And it's about direct mutation for PGT-M, and rather than using, you know, the technology we've used for the last 30 years, haplotyping, how far away is offering direct mutation for PGT-M without the need for additional reference samples?
Yeah, certainly it's an exciting topic, something that we've explored and are continuing to explore. It is in R&D right now, but I would anticipate that, you know, we're going to attempt to at least move it more towards, you know, a PGT-M offering. I would hope, you know, in the next year or so, maybe a little bit longer. But it is certainly a process that, like you said, Tony, eliminates reference, takes that, you know, that turnaround time from on the order of months to, you know, potentially in the same time as, say, PGT-A. So it is a really exciting option, but obviously you want to make sure that it's incredibly accurate and be very confident in those results.
Absolutely. Well, thanks, Chris and Doug. Super conversation. Really enjoyed it today. And I'd just like to wrap up by handing it back to Matt Eyre, our Global Product Manager for our PGT, for a few last words. Over to you, Matt.
Hi, thanks, Tony. And thank you so much for all the speakers today. Really exciting topics. And thank you so much for the group interacting and engaging with us in the question and answer section. Also, I wanted to point out to everybody on the call, we've got a fantastic tool that's completely free, and it's found online. This is our clinician's PGT-A reference tool, something that you can keep on your desk, and really will help you counsel patients and set up expectations as to the number of euploid embryos that they should expect to see depending on their age and the total number of embryos that they have within their cycle. So please visit the QR code and go to our website to download this tool. Finally, thank you so much again for joining today, and we hope to have you back for a webinar in the future. Bye, everybody.